Sandra Bullock stood quietly in the first-class line at LAX, dressed in relaxed travel attire and a simple baseball cap. Despite her understated presence, she still caught the attention of a woman in high-end designer clothing, who couldn't help but throw judgmental glances her way. This woman, adorned from head to toe in luxury brands, leaned over to whisper something to her companion, gesturing towards Sandra's casual outfit. What happened next? It would leave the entire first-class cabin in stunned silence and deliver an unforgettable lesson on what true class really means. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love real stories about celebrities who stay humble despite their fame, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow, we have another heartwarming story that will touch your soul. Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual chaos, the rolling of luggage, rushed conversations, and flight announcements echoing through the terminal. Inside the exclusive first-class lounge, Sandra Bullock sat quietly in a corner, absorbed in the pages of a well-worn paperback. She wore simple black leggings, an oversized sweater, and comfortable running shoes, the kind of outfit chosen by someone who values comfort over flashy appearances during a long flight. With no makeup on, her natural beauty still radiated, the same charm that had captivated audiences for years. But today, she seemed perfectly happy blending into the background. Across the lounge, however, sat Margaret Winchester, a woman who refused to go unnoticed. Her Hermes bag occupied its own seat, her diamond jewelry sparkled under the fluorescent lights, and her perfectly styled hair suggested hours spent at a high-end salon. She didn't just believe she belonged in first class. She acted as though she owned it. The moment her eyes landed on Sandra, her flawless, red-painted lips curled into a subtle sneer. She leaned toward her companion, her voice just loud enough to be heard. "Can you believe who they're letting into first class these days? I remember when this lounge had standards." Her words lingered in the air like an overpowering perfume, impossible to ignore. Sandra, who had heard plenty of similar comments throughout her career, simply turned another page in her book, unbothered. Her calm composure stood in stark contrast to Margaret's blatant attempt to draw attention. The tension in the lounge grew thick as a few passengers exchanged awkward glances, unsure of whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard a thing. But what nobody noticed was the man who had just entered the lounge. Dressed in a simple black jacket, his kind eyes quietly observed the scene unfolding before him. And though no one knew it yet, his presence would soon turn an ordinary flight into a lesson that no one on board would ever forget. As first-class passengers lined up to board, Margaret made sure she was directly behind Sandra. Her Louis Vuitton carry-on trailed behind her like a peacock flaunting its feathers. "First class?" Margaret's voice dripped with fake surprise as she glanced at Sandra's boarding pass. "How interesting." Sandra turned slightly, offering a polite smile, the same smile that had charmed millions on screen. But Margaret? She wasn't done yet. "You know," Margaret continued, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I remember when flying first class meant something. When people dressed for the occasion." She gestured at her own Chanel suit with a smug smile. Sandra, adjusting her baseball cap, remained composed, unshaken by the obvious attempt to belittle her. The boarding process continued, and fate had placed Sandra's seat directly across the aisle from Margaret's. As Sandra stored her simple backpack in the overhead bin, Margaret let out an exaggerated sigh. "Darling," she cooed, her voice sticky sweet but laced with venom, "I think you might have wandered into the wrong section. Economy is further back." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others buried their faces in their phones, pretending not to hear. Sandra, unbothered, settled into her seat with grace and pulled out her book once more. But the fact that she wasn't reacting? It only irritated Margaret more. "It's just that some of us," Margaret continued, adjusting her designer scarf with a dramatic flourish, "work very hard to maintain certain standards. We pay a premium for a premium experience." She shot a meaningful glance at Sandra's casual attire. "Though I suppose not everyone understands that concept." At that moment, the flight attendant approached with pre-flight drinks. And just as she did, The man in the black jacket from earlier stepped down the aisle. He paused, eyes locking with Sandra's, sharing a subtle smile of recognition. Margaret, too consumed by her own performance, failed to notice this silent exchange, one that was about to turn her carefully crafted world upside down. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when Margaret decided to take things up a notch. Sipping her champagne with exaggerated elegance, she turned to her companion, her voice carrying through the cabin. "You know, Sarah," she mused loudly, "I was just telling Harrison at the country club how standards have fallen everywhere. First class used to mean first class." She shot a pointed glance at Sandra. "Now? It seems anyone can wander in wearing whatever they picked up at Target." At that, Sandra calmly placed a bookmark in her novel and turned to face Margaret directly. Her gaze, though warm, held a quiet strength. Passengers leaned in, anticipating what she would say. "You seem very concerned about appearances," Sandra said softly, her voice carrying an undeniable grace. Margaret's carefully maintained smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Well, someone has to uphold standards. I've worked too hard to sit here and watch it all go to." She stopped mid-sentence, because standing before her, just a few rows ahead, was the man in the black jacket. And as he turned around, passengers gasped, recognition sweeping through the cabin. Keanu Reeves. He walked down the aisle with his signature quiet confidence, stopping right between Sandra and Margaret. "Hey, Sandy," he greeted warmly, leaning down to embrace Sandra in a friendly hug. Margaret's face froze mid-sneer. "Keanu? I didn't know you were on this flight." Sandra's voice held genuine delight. The two shared an easy, familiar exchange, clearly old friends. Margaret's champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand as reality sank in. The other passengers, who had been pretending not to listen, now openly stared. Keanu turned to Margaret, his expression kind yet firm. "You know," he said, his voice carrying that signature gentle authority, "I couldn't help but overhear your thoughts on standards." He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. "But in my experience, true class has very little to do with what we wear or how much we pay for a seat." Margaret clutched her champagne glass tighter. Sandra added softly, "Keanu and I learned long ago that how we treat others matters far more than designer labels or first-class tickets." Silence filled the cabin. And then, someone from the back let out a quiet chuckle. "All that fuss about class, and you didn't even recognize it sitting right in front of you." Margaret's face turned pale. The lesson was clear. True class isn't about money or appearances. It's about kindness, humility, and how you treat others, especially when you think no one important is watching.